Archaeology has a remarkable power. It can resurrect entire civilizations from the shadows of history. By the end of this video, you will see how each of these 20 cities forced historians to completely rethink what they thought they knew about the past. These were not just piles of stone or isolated artifacts. They were thriving communities, bustling with people, trade, and ambition, thought lost forever until careful excavation and patient study pulled them back into the historical record. And here is the key: every single city on this list was not simply rediscovered. It was actively reinterpreted. The evidence forced scholars to rewrite chapters of human history, challenging deep-held assumptions about who built what and when. The diversity is staggering. You will travel from the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia to the sweeping deserts of Africa, from the soaring peaks of the Andes to forgotten plains in North America. Each stop reveals a lost world brought back to light, and each one changes how we understand the human story. What does it take for a city to be forgotten so completely that its very existence becomes a legend, only to be brought back to light centuries later? Deep in the Cambodian jungle, a city lay hidden for centuries. The great capital of the Khmer Empire, Angkor, was not simply abandoned. It was slowly swallowed by the forest, its stone temples and vast water systems reclaimed by roots and vines. For generations, local communities kept its memory alive through oral traditions, and a handful of travelers from distant lands brought back scattered accounts of a lost wonder hidden among the trees. But it was not until the 19th and 20th centuries that systematic archaeology, much of it led by French scholars, began to uncover the true scale of what had been lost. At its peak in the 12th century, Angkor was one of the largest pre-industrial urban centers the world had ever seen. Estimates suggest its population may have exceeded 1 million people, spread across a landscape that stretched for hundreds of square miles. The heart of the city was Angkor Thom, a fortified royal complex, and at its center stood the Temple of Angkor Wat, an architectural masterpiece dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. The Khmer rulers constructed an elaborate system of canals, reservoirs, and moats to manage seasonal monsoon rains and sustain agriculture through dry periods. This hydraulic network was the lifeblood of the empire, allowing rice cultivation to feed a massive population. Yet that same system also contributed to Angkor's decline. Scientists now believe that prolonged climate shifts, including severe droughts followed by intense flooding, placed immense strain on the water infrastructure. Canals and reservoirs became difficult to maintain, and the delicate balance that had supported the city for centuries began to unravel. Over time, the population dispersed and the jungle advanced. By the 16th century, the city was largely abandoned, remembered only in local stories and in the journals of a few European missionaries and traders. The real rediscovery began in the mid-19th century when the French naturalist Henri Mauhot brought Angkor Wat to the attention of the Western world. He did not discover it himself, but his detailed writing sparked international fascination. Over the following decades, French archaeologists and conservators undertook massive projects to clear the overgrowth, document the temples, and stabilize crumbling structures. They uncovered the sprawling urban grid of Angkor Thom with its monumental gates and terraces, and restored vast sections of Angkor Wat, but the most astonishing revelations came only recently. In the early 21st century, archaeologists used a technology called light detection and ranging, which uses lasers mounted on aircraft to map the ground beneath dense vegetation. The results were stunning. Beneath the forest canopy, the lasers revealed an entire hidden urban grid. Roads, canals, temple groups, and residential areas laid out in a precise geometric pattern that stretched far beyond the known temple complexes. What had appeared to be scattered monuments in the jungle was actually the skeleton of a vast, planned metropolis. the Khmer engineers had designed a city on a scale that rivaled any in the medieval world. This rediscovery did more than simply recover a lost city. It forced historians to re-evaluate the sophistication of medieval Southeast Asian civilizations. Angkor was not a collection of isolated temples. It was a fully integrated urban center with advanced water management, centralized planning, and a complex economy. Its fall was not a collapse into chaos but a gradual transformation shaped by environmental pressures, and its resurrection through archaeology changed how we understand the capabilities of human societies outside Europe during the Middle Ages. That same pattern of lost and found, of a city buried by nature and revealed by science, repeats itself across the globe. Our next stop takes us to the highlands of South America, where another civilization built a mountain citadel so remote that it remained hidden from the outside world for centuries. On the high plains of southern Africa, a different kind of lost city emerged from the earth. Great Zimbabwe, a sprawling complex of stone walls and towers, was built between the 11th and 15th centuries. It was the heart of a powerful Shona trading empire, a kingdom that controlled vast networks of gold and ivory. Its most striking feature is the Great Enclosure, a massive circular wall made of granite blocks, stacked without mortar, standing nearly 11 meters high in places. The precision of the dry stone construction left early European visitors in disbelief. When Portuguese traders first heard rumors of the site in the 16th century, they assumed it must have been the work of Phoenicians or Egyptians, anyone but the local African population. That belief hardened with the arrival of European explorers in the 19th century. They arrived expecting to find primitive settlements and found instead a city that rivaled the architectural achievements of medieval Europe. Unable to accept that sub-Saharan Africans could have designed such a place, they invented elaborate theories involving lost civilizations, biblical figures, or ancient colonists from the Middle East. This was not simple ignorance. It was a deliberate attempt to erase the achievements of an African society, a pattern that reflected the racist thinking of the colonial era. Systematic archaeology, led by figures like the British scholar David Randall MacIver in 1905 and later by Gertrude Catton Thompson in 1929, proved the truth beyond dispute. The stonework, the pottery, the tools, all of it was distinctly African, rooted in local traditions that had evolved over centuries, and the evidence went further. Excavations uncovered glass beads from India, porcelain from China, and Arab coins from the Swahili coast. Great Zimbabwe was not isolated. It was a central node in a global trade network that linked the interior of Africa to the markets of the Indian Ocean and beyond. The city was also a political and religious center. The king lived within the high stone walls, and his authority was tied to the sacred hill complex known as the Acropolis. Rituals performed there reinforced the connection between the ruler and the ancestors, binding the community together. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe thrived until a combination of environmental strain and shifting trade routes led to its gradual decline. By the 15th century, the population had dispersed and the stone city stood silent, but its legacy never faded. Local Shona communities always remembered the site, and their oral traditions preserved its history. When colonial narratives were finally overturned by archaeological evidence, Great Zimbabwe was restored to its rightful place. Today it stands as a national symbol, a source of pride for Zimbabwe, and a powerful reminder that the medieval world was far more connected and sophisticated than many once believed. The stones do not lie, and they have spoken clearly. High in the Peruvian Andes, at an elevation of nearly 8,000 feet, a citadel of white granite clings to a ridge between two towering peaks. Machu Picchu was built around 1450 by the Inca Emperor Pachacuti, and for centuries it remained known only to the local Quechua farmers who lived in the surrounding valleys. It was never truly lost to them. They knew exactly where it was, but they had no reason to speak of it to outsiders. The outside world had no idea it existed until an American historian named Hiram Bingham arrived in 1911, guided by local residents who showed him the overgrown ruins. Bingham did not discover Machu Picchu in the sense of uncovering something unknown. He was led there, and his subsequent publications and photographs brought the site to global attention. But what he found was a marvel of Inca engineering, preserved in near-perfect condition because it had been abandoned and then left untouched for centuries. The citadel was likely a royal estate and religious retreat for Pachacuti and his court. Its layout follows the natural contours of the mountain, with terraced agricultural fields that cling to steep slopes, preventing erosion and providing food for the inhabitants. Water was channeled through a sophisticated system of stone aqueducts and fountains that still function today. The Inca builders carved the granite blocks so precisely that no mortar was needed, and the walls have withstood earthquakes for over 500 years. Yet one mystery remains. Machu Picchu was abandoned sometime around the early 16th century, before the Spanish conquistadors ever reached this remote region. There are no signs of battle or destruction. Some scholars suggest the population declined due to disease or that the site was simply no longer needed after Pachacuti's death. Others argue that the Spanish conquest disrupted the Inca road networks and supply lines, making the high-altitude estate impractical to maintain. Whatever the reason, the city was left to the cloud forest, its stones slowly covered in moss and vines. Because it was never discovered by the Spanish, its structures remained intact, offering archaeologists an unspoiled window into Inca urban planning. The agricultural terraces, the ceremonial plazas, the astronomical observatory known as the Intihuatana stone, all of it survives in remarkable detail. Machu Picchu is not a lost city in the same way Angkor was buried by jungle or Great Zimbabwe was erased by colonial narratives. It is a preserved moment frozen in time, revealing the brilliance of the Inca civilization at its peak. And its rediscovery did not just add a famous landmark to the map. It forced historians to recognize that the Inca were not just stone builders. They were master engineers who understood hydrology, agriculture, and astronomy on a level that still impresses modern scientists. That same blend of natural preservation and human ingenuity will appear again as we move to our next lost city, one that was swallowed not by forest but by the desert itself. Deep in the Guatemalan jungle, the stone spires of Tikal pierce the canopy. At its height between the 6th and 9th centuries, this was one of the most powerful city-states of the classic Maya world. Its grand plazas, towering pyramids, and sprawling residential districts covered more than 40 square miles, and its population may have reached over 60,000 people. Then, around the year 900, the great city fell silent. Its plazas emptied, its temples were sealed, and the rainforest slowly pulled the stonework back into the earth. For nearly 1,000 years, Tikal slumbered, hidden beneath a thick blanket of vegetation that made it nearly invisible from the ground. The Maya who remained in the region never entirely forgot the place, but to the outside world it was little more than rumor. In the mid-19th century, a handful of European explorers, guided by local inhabitants, pushed through the jungle and came upon the first of the limestone temples, their roofs covered in moss and tangled vines. These early reports sparked fascination but produced only partial sketches. It was not until the 1950s that large-scale archaeology began in earnest. The University of Pennsylvania launched a long-term project that would transform the study of Maya civilization. Workers cleared the dense growth and exposed a city of breathtaking ambition. 5 main temple pyramids, the tallest reaching over 200 feet, a grand Acropolis complex of palaces and courtyards, and a network of causeways connecting the ceremonial core to outlying neighborhoods. But the most revolutionary discoveries came not from the architecture but from the writing. Tikal was covered in hieroglyphic inscriptions carved into stone monuments called stelae and on the lintels of its buildings. For decades, scholars had dismissed Maya writing as purely calendrical and ceremonial. The pen team, working alongside epigraphers, slowly cracked the code. They discovered that these inscriptions told a detailed dynastic history spanning centuries, the names of rulers, their conquests, their marriages, and their diplomatic alliances. One stela recorded the arrival of the founder of a new dynasty around the year 378, a figure who came from another Maya city, Teotihuacan, far to the west. This single piece of carved stone rewrote the timeline of political relations across Mesoamerica. Tikal was not a peaceable kingdom guided by mystical priests. It was a militaristic, competitive state that waged war, formed strategic partnerships, and projected power over a wide territory. The hieroglyphic record also documented the city's eventual unraveling. By the late 8th century, the texts become sparse. Carvings stop abruptly around 900. The reasons are complex, but the evidence points to a combination of prolonged drought, soil exhaustion from centuries of intensive farming, and a population that had grown beyond what the land could support. Political rivalries intensified and the central authority fractured. One by one, the rulers stopped erecting monuments, and the city entered a slow decline. The people did not vanish overnight, but they drifted away as the forests reclaimed the farms and reservoirs. Tikal's reemergence did more than add a spectacular sight to the map. It forced archaeologists to abandon the romantic notion of the Maya as gentle astronomers detached from worldly affairs. The inscriptions revealed a society with a sophisticated writing system, a complex calendar, and a political history as rich and bloody as any in the Old World. Today, researchers continue to extract new information from Tikal. LiDAR scans, the same technology used at Angkor, have revealed hidden agricultural terraces, defensive walls, and vast suburban settlements previously invisible beneath the jungle. The site is not a finished puzzle. It is a living archive that still has secrets to give up, and each season brings fresh insights into how one of the America's greatest cities rose, ruled, and then returned to the earth. Deep in the desert canyons of Jordan, a city of stone blossoms from the cliffs, Petra, carved into rose-red rock, was hidden from the Western world for centuries, though it was never truly lost. The local Bedouin communities knew its narrow passages and towering facades intimately. They had lived among the ruins for generations, using the caves as shelter and pasturing their goats in the shadow of the ancient tombs. But to outsiders, Petra was a ghost, a whisper carried by travelers who spoke of a wondrous lost city chiseled into the mountains, the walls of the Sick, a winding gorge that leads into the heart of Petra, rose over 100 meters high, and at the end of that corridor, the treasury suddenly appears, a magnificent facade carved directly into the sandstone, glowing in shades of pink and orange. That site greeted the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt in 1812, but he did not arrive as a Swiss explorer. He disguised himself as an Arab traveler, speaking fluent Arabic, and persuaded his Bedouin guides to take him to the tomb of the prophet Aaron, a pilgrimage site that would pass through the hidden valley. When he finally laid eyes on the treasury and the vast complex beyond, he knew he had found something extraordinary. Burckhardt kept his discovery quiet at first, but his detailed journals, published after his death, electrified the Western world. Petra had been a wealthy trade hub centuries before. At its peak, from the 1st century BC into the 2nd century AD, the Nabataean people controlled the lucrative incense and spice routes that crossed the Arabian Peninsula. Caravans laden with frankincense, myrrh, and silk passed through Petra, and the city taxed every shipment. That wealth paid for an engineering marvel that the desert climate demanded. Nabataean engineers carved an intricate system of channels, pipes, and cisterns into the sandstone, capturing every drop of seasonal rain and storing it for the dry months. Some of these conduits ran along the walls of the Sikh, carrying fresh water to fountains and reservoirs throughout the city. The system was so effective that Petra supported a population of perhaps 20,000 in a region that today receives only a few inches of rain per year. The Nabataeans were master hydrologists, and their water management allowed the city to thrive in an environment that would seem hostile to urban life. Then the Romans annexed the Nabataean kingdom in 106 AD, and Petra became a provincial outpost. Trade routes gradually shifted north to Palmyra, and the city's economic importance faded. Earthquakes in the 4th and 6th centuries toppled many of the monumental buildings, and over time the population dwindled. By the early Middle Ages, Petra was largely abandoned, its rock-cut tombs and temples serving only as shelter for shepherds and hermits. The city that had once bustled with merchants from Arabia, India, and China fell into a long sleep. For centuries, the site receded into local memory, known only to the Bedouin who guarded its secrets. Then Burckhardt's account prompted a wave of exploration. In the 19th and 20th centuries, archaeologists cleared the debris that had accumulated in the canyon floor. They excavated the treasury, revealing a lower level of columns and a chamber that had been filled with silt. They uncovered a vast theater cut into the rock that could seat over 6,000 people, and the remains of a grand temple complex now called the Great Temple, though its true purpose remains debated. The tombs, over 800 of them, climbed the surrounding cliffs in tiers, each one a statement of status and wealth. But the most astonishing discoveries came in the 21st century. Using satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar, archaeologists detected anomalies beneath the surface that hinted at structures far larger than anyone had suspected. In 2016, a team using drone photography and radar found a massive ceremonial platform hidden under rubble just a few hundred meters from the treasury. It measured about 160 feet by 130 feet, with a staircase on one side and what appeared to be a smaller platform on top. This was not a tomb or a temple in the conventional sense. It was something new, a monumental structure that had never been seen, even by the Bedouin who had walked over the spot for generations. The find doubled the known footprint of Petra's ceremonial core. Further surveys suggested that the city extended far beyond the main canyon, with suburbs, agricultural terraces, and water management features spread across a much wider landscape. The Nabataeans had built not just a single gorge but an entire urbanized territory. Each new technology, from radar to LiDAR, peels back another layer of the story. Petra's rediscovery did more than add a spectacular site to the tourist itinerary. It resurrected an entire civilization. Before the 19th century, the Nabataeans were known mainly from a few scattered references in Greek and Roman texts. Their existence was barely a footnote. Now, thanks to the careful work of archaeologists, we understand them as a sophisticated people who mastered the desert, built a commercial empire, and created an artistic tradition that blended influences from all the cultures they traded with. Their city, carved into living rock, stands as a permanent record of their ambition, and it is still yielding secrets one radar scan at a time. On the Bay of Naples in southern Italy, a Roman city of 20,000 people vanished in less than 2 days. Mount Vesuvius had been rumbling for years, but no one recognized the warning signs. On the 24th of August in the year 79, the mountain exploded with a force that sent a column of ash and pumice more than 20 miles into the sky. For 18 hours, the city was bombarded with falling debris. Roofs collapsed under the weight. People fled or sheltered where they could. Then the pyroclastic surges came, a superheated avalanche of gas and ash that rolled down the mountainside at hurricane speed, incinerating everything in its path. When the cloud cleared, Pompeii was gone, buried under up to 20 feet of volcanic material. The city was not destroyed in the sense of being torn apart by violence. It was sealed, locked inside a tomb of ash that would preserve its streets, its buildings, and even the shapes of its inhabitants for nearly 17 centuries. For generations afterward, local farmers knew that the ground above Pompeii was strange. They would plow up bits of marble and broken pottery, and sometimes even coins. But it was not until the late 16th century that a canal digger accidentally cut into a wall covered in frescoes, the first glimpse of the lost city. Even then, the discovery went mostly unremarked. Systematic excavation did not begin until the 18th century under the Bourbon king Charles III, who ordered tunnels dug into the hardened ash. What they found was beyond imagination. Entire houses stood intact, their painted walls still vibrant, temples and public baths, a forum lined with columns, and a marketplace stocked with the carbonized remains of food, all of it preserved as it had been on that August morning. The excavators uncovered bakeries with ovens still holding loaves of bread, shops with jars of olive oil and garum, the fermented fish sauce that Romans loved, and a complete amphitheater carved into the earth. But the most haunting discoveries came later. As archaeologists cleared the ash, they noticed voids, empty spaces where organic material had decomposed. In 1863, the director of excavations, Giuseppe Fiorelli, had an inspired idea. He poured liquid plaster into these cavities, let it harden, and then chipped away the surrounding ash. The result was a cast of the final moments of the victims, their bodies, their clothing, their postures frozen in time. One cast shows a family huddled together against a wall. Another captures a person curled in a fetal position, hands covering their mouth. These were not statues. They were precise records of human tragedy, preserved by the very eruption that had taken their lives. The plaster casts changed the way people understood Pompeii. It was no longer just a collection of ruins. It was a human story, a moment of horror and loss captured with scientific fidelity. That emotional weight drew scholars, artists, and writers from across Europe. The site influenced the neoclassical movement in architecture and painting. It inspired novels, most famously Edward Bulwer Lytton's The Last Days of Pompeii, and it became a standard stop on the grand tour that educated young aristocrats traveled to complete their cultural education. For archaeology, Pompeii was a revolution. Before its excavation, the discipline was largely about collecting artifacts and reconstructing monuments. Pompeii demanded new methods, the careful removal of ash, the documentation of every layer, the recovery of everyday objects like cooking pots and dice and graffiti. All of it shifted the focus from kings and battles to the lived experience of ordinary people. Today, we know more about the daily life of a Roman baker or a tavern keeper in Pompeii than we do about many medieval kings. The graffiti alone is a treasure, a running commentary of love notes, political slogans, and even insults scratched into the walls. One reads, "I have asked for the girl, but she has denied me." Another says, "The one who loves, let him live, let him perish who loves not." These voices, preserved in plaster and ash, speak directly across 2,000 years. And yet, for all its fame, Pompeii was never truly lost. Its location was known. Its memory survived in ancient texts, including a letter by the Roman writer Pliny the Younger, who described the eruption in detail. The city's rediscovery did not resurrect a forgotten civilization. It refined and deepened a picture that had always been partially visible. In that sense, Pompeii stands apart from the other cities on our list. It was a known casualty of history waiting to be uncovered, not a rumor that had to be proven true. But its excavation set a standard. The techniques developed at Pompeii, the patience, the precision, the attention to detail, would soon be applied to sites that had vanished far more completely. Cities that existed only in legend or in the faintest of whispers, those are the ones that would truly transform our understanding of the past, and that is exactly where we are headed next. The city of Troy existed for centuries only in the pages of epic poetry. Homer's Iliad described a great war fought over a woman, with heroes like Achilles and Hector clashing beneath towering walls. For generations, scholars debated whether Troy was real or just a story, a myth passed down through the ages. Then, in the 1870s, a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann decided to find it. He followed clues in the ancient text, traveled to northwestern Turkey, and began digging at a mound called Hisarlik. What he uncovered shocked the world. Beneath the soil lay not one city but many, stacked layer upon layer like a geological cake of human ambition. Schliemann immediately claimed he had found the Troy of Homer, the city of King Priam. He even declared that a cache of gold and silver objects he unearthed was the treasure of Priam, the legendary king's personal wealth. But Schliemann's methods were anything but careful. He dug massive trenches straight through the site, destroying valuable archaeological layers in his rush to reach the deepest levels. He mixed artifacts from different time periods, and his dating was often guesswork. Worse, he smuggled the so-called treasure out of Turkey, sparking a legal and diplomatic dispute that continues to echo today. Professional archaeologists soon took over, and their work revealed a far more complex story. The mound at Hisarlik contained at least 9 major settlement layers, spanning from the early Bronze Age around 3000 BC all the way to the Roman period. The layer Schliemann had called Priam's Troy, which he labeled Troy Roman II, turned out to be much older, dating to around 2500 BC, centuries before any possible Homeric war. The real candidate for the city of the Iliad is either Troy VI or Troy Roman VII. Troy VI, built around 1700 BC, was a wealthy, fortified city with massive stone walls, some still standing over 5 meters high. Its layout suggests a well-planned urban center with a citadel, residential areas, and a lower town. Trade goods from Crete, Cyprus, and the Near East found at the site show that Troy was not an isolated fortress but a thriving commercial hub controlling the vital Dardanelles Strait. Then, around 1200 BC, Troy VI was destroyed, likely by a major earthquake. The city was rebuilt as Troy Roman VII, which shows signs of crowded living conditions, storage jars buried in the floors, and evidence of a siege. It was this layer that met a violent end, burned and abandoned around 1180 BC, very close to the traditional date of the Trojan War. Archaeologists found arrowheads, sling stones, and scorched debris, all consistent with a hostile attack. But was it the Greeks of Homer's epic? No single inscription names Agamemnon or Helen. What the evidence does show is that a real fortified city, tied into the trade networks of the Eastern Mediterranean, was destroyed by warfare at the end of the Bronze Age. The memory of that conflict, passed down through oral tradition, likely became the kernel of the epic that Homer later shaped. Troy's rediscovery did not confirm every detail of the Iliad. It did something more profound. It proved that a legendary city had a physical foundation. The walls, the pottery, the imported goods, the destruction layers, all of it gave material substance to a story that had been dismissed as pure fantasy. For the first time, scholars had to take Homer seriously as a source of historical memory. The Iliad was not a perfect record, but it preserved echoes of a real world, a world of Mycenaean kings, Anatolian cities, and Bronze Age warfare. This shift changed how we study early Aegean societies. Instead of treating the Homeric poems as literature only, archaeologists began to use them as guides, cautious but invaluable, to a lost past. Troy became the bridge between myth and history, a city that had to be excavated layer by layer to separate story from stone. Babylon was a name that echoed through centuries before a single brick was ever uncovered. For most of history, it existed only in the pages of scripture, in the accounts of Greek historians, and in the imagination of poets. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, were described as a marvel of engineering, a mountain of greenery rising above the Mesopotamian plain. The Ishtar Gate, clad in brilliant blue glazed bricks with rows of bulls and dragons, was said to be so magnificent that even Alexander the Great, who died in the city in 323 BC, was awestruck. Yet after the 1st century AD, Babylon slowly faded from the living world. Its canals silted up, its palaces crumbled, and the great walls that once encircled the city became mounds of dirt and debris. By the time European travelers reached the site in the 17th and 18th centuries, they found little more than a desolate landscape of low hills, with only a few shattered remnants of brickwork visible above the sand. Many doubted that the legendary city had ever existed at all. The systematic recovery of Babylon began in 1899, when a German archaeologist named Robert Koldewey arrived with a team from the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, the German Oriental Society. They did not come to prove the Bible correct or to confirm Greek legends. They came to apply rigorous scientific methods to a site that had been scavenged for building materials for centuries. Koldewey and his team dug for nearly 18 years until the outbreak of the First World War forced them to stop. During that time, they uncovered the foundations of the Great Palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, the throne room with its famous facade of glazed bricks, and the massive processional way that led from the city center to the Ishtar Gate. They found the foundations of the Ziggurat Etemenanke, a step tower that many scholars believe inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, but the excavation was not a simple recovery. The site had suffered badly. For generations, local farmers had dug into the mounds to extract bricks for their own buildings, destroying entire structures in the process. The water table had risen, saturating the lower levels and rotting any organic material. And in the 20th century, Saddam Hussein undertook ambitious reconstruction projects that covered original ruins with new bricks, confusing the archaeological record. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent military presence caused further damage, as heavy vehicles drove over fragile areas and trenches were dug through ancient layers. Despite all of this, the work of Koldewey and later teams succeeded in reconstructing the basic layout of the city. Babylon was not a chaotic jumble of buildings. It was a planned urban center with straight streets, a defensive wall system that stretched for miles, and a carefully organized network of canals and reservoirs that brought water from the Euphrates River into the heart of the city. The inner walls alone were over 10 kilometers long and wide enough for chariots to ride along the top. The palace complex covered an area of nearly 5 hectares and contained multiple courtyards, audience halls, and private apartments. And then there were the clay tablets. By the thousands, cuneiform tablets emerged from the soil. These were not royal inscriptions or epic poems. They were receipts, contracts, letters, and legal documents that recorded the daily rhythm of life in Babylon. One tablet details the sale of a house, including the dimensions of each room and the names of the neighbors. Another records a loan of silver with interest rates and a repayment schedule. A third preserves a lawsuit over a disputed inheritance, complete with witness statements and a judge's ruling. These tablets, written in the Akkadian language, offered a direct window into the lives of ordinary Babylonians, merchants, priests, farmers, and slaves. They revealed a society governed by a sophisticated legal code that regulated everything from marriage to trade to property rights. The famous Code of Hammurabi, though earlier, was part of this same tradition. The tablets also documented the religious life of the city. Priests at the Temple of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, kept meticulous records of offerings, festivals, and divination rituals. They recorded astronomical observations and mathematical calculations that later influenced Greek and Islamic science. One text even describes the construction of a new statue of Marduk, specifying the materials, the dimensions, and the ceremonies required to install it in the sanctuary. This was not a mythical city. It was a real capital of a vast empire that once stretched from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Its king, Nebuchadnezzar, was not a figure of legend but a historical ruler who built canals, conquered Jerusalem, and deported its inhabitants to Babylon, an event recorded both in the Hebrew Bible and in Babylonian chronicles. When scholars deciphered these chronicles, they found a year-by-year account of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, including the exact date of his capture of Jerusalem in 597 BC. The biblical story and the clay tablet matched. Archaeology had done something remarkable. It had taken a city that was known almost entirely through literary and religious tradition and given it a physical reality. Babylon was no longer a symbol of decadence and divine punishment, a cautionary tale from scripture. It was a place where people really lived, worked, worshipped, and governed themselves with sophisticated systems of law and record-keeping. It was a real city with a real history, a history that could be studied, debated, and understood on its own terms. That same movement from myth to material reality will guide us as we travel east to the heart of the Persian Empire, where another great capital waited beneath the sands, equally grand, equally lost, but with a very different story to tell. On a vast plain in modern-day Iran, a city lay buried for nearly 2,000 years. Its name was Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a place built to impress the world and project the power of a dynasty that ruled from the Indus River to the Mediterranean. In 330 BC, Alexander the Great swept through with his army, and in a decision that still stirs debate among historians, he ordered the city set ablaze. The fire raged for days, collapsing cedar roofs, shattering limestone reliefs, and melting the gold and silver that adorned the palaces. When the flames died, the city was left as a blackened skeleton, exposed to the wind and rain. Over the centuries, sediment from the surrounding mountains gradually drifted over the ruins, burying them under layers of dirt and debris. The local population, living in the shadow of the mounds, knew that something ancient lay beneath, but the precise nature of the site faded from collective memory. A few scattered references in Greek and Roman texts kept the name alive, but the city itself became a ghost, known only through the words of its conquerors. The first European travelers to reach the site in the 17th and 18th centuries described a field of colossal stone columns and broken staircases rising from the desert. They sketched the carved figures, the rows of men bearing gifts, the winged bulls, and the inscriptions in a script no one could read. These early accounts were fascinating but incomplete. They recorded what was visible above ground, but the true scale of Persepolis remained hidden. It was not until the 1930s that systematic excavation began, led by the Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago under the direction of Ernst Herzfeld and later Erich Schmidt. Their team cleared the accumulated soil and revealed a complex of palaces, audience halls, and treasuries that covered over 125,000 square meters. The centerpiece was the Apadana, a grand audience hall supported by 72 columns, each over 20 meters tall. The surviving bases and capitals, carved into the shapes of bulls and lions, hinted at the original grandeur, but the most extraordinary feature of the Apadana was its staircase. Carved in low relief along the northern and eastern facades were processions of figures spanning the entire length of the steps. They represented delegations from every corner of the empire: Medes and Elamites, Babylonians and Assyrians, Egyptians and Indians, Scythians and Lydians. Each group was depicted in its distinctive dress, carrying its characteristic tribute: textiles, vessels, animals, precious metals. This was not just art. It was a visual census of the Achaemenid world, a direct statement of imperial unity and diversity carved in stone. Those reliefs alone would have been enough to reshape our understanding of Persian rule. But Persepolis also yielded inscriptions, most notably on the nearby mountain of Behistun, about 200 miles to the west. There, high on a cliff face, the Persian king Darius the Great had ordered a trilingual inscription carved in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. It recounted his rise to power, his defeat of rebels, and the restoration of order across the empire. For centuries, the inscription was visible but unreadable, its wedge-shaped script a mystery. In the 1830s, a British army officer named Henry Rawlinson, who was stationed in Persia, risked his life climbing the cliff to copy the text. Working with other scholars, he used the known vocabulary of Middle Persian, a later descendant of Old Persian, to begin deciphering the ancient script. The Behistun inscription became the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform, providing the key that unlocked the written records of Mesopotamia and Persia. Once the script was deciphered, scholars could read the inscriptions from Persepolis itself. They found royal proclamations, building records, and administrative documents that revealed the inner workings of the Achaemenid bureaucracy. One text described the construction of the Apadana, the materials imported from distant provinces, the craftsmen brought from across the empire, and the precise dimensions of the hall. Another recorded the number of gold vessels kept in the treasury and the rations distributed to workers. These were not myths or legends. These were the words of the Persian kings themselves, speaking directly across the centuries. The recovery of Persepolis did more than add a magnificent ruin to the map. It restored the voice of a civilization that had been known almost exclusively through the eyes of its enemies. For millennia, the story of the Persian Empire was written by Greek historians like Herodotus, who portrayed the Persians as decadent, despotic, and alien. The Greeks were brilliant storytellers, but they were also biased observers, writing from the perspective of a people who had fought bitter wars against Persia. Their accounts were invaluable, but they were only one side of the story. The carvings at Persepolis, the inscriptions on its walls, and the administrative tablets found in its treasury presented a different picture. An empire that valued order, tolerated diversity, and governed through a sophisticated system of satraps, roads, and postal relays. The reliefs on the Apadana staircase showed the Persian king receiving tribute, not as a conqueror looting his subjects, but as a ruler who presided over a peaceful federation of nations. Each delegation brought gifts willingly, or so the official narrative claimed. Whether fully accurate or idealized, this was the Persian self-image, and it contradicted the Greek caricature in nearly every detail. For the first time, historians could compare the two perspectives and construct a more balanced understanding of the Achaemenid world. Persepolis had been silenced by fire, then buried by the desert, but archaeology pulled it back into the light. And in doing so, it gave us an alternative to the Greek story, a Persian voice that had been waiting in the stone for over 2,000 years. Far to the west, another lost city emerged from a very different landscape. Palmyra rose in the heart of the Syrian desert as an oasis of stone and ambition. For centuries, it was a crossroads where the Roman and Parthian empires met, not in conflict but in commerce. Caravans laden with silk from China, spices from India, and glass from Phoenicia passed through its colonnaded streets, and the city grew wealthy on the taxes it collected from every shipment. By the 1st century AD, Palmyra was one of the richest trading centers in the ancient world, and its architecture reflected that blending of cultures. The Temple of Bel, with its soaring podium and ornate sanctuary, combined Roman proportions with Near Eastern religious symbolism. The Great Colonnade, stretching over a kilometer, was lined with statues of local merchants and Roman officials, a visual statement of a city that belonged to both worlds. Even the language of Palmyra was a hybrid. The local dialect of Aramaic, written in a distinctive script, appeared alongside Greek and Latin on public inscriptions, showing a society fluent in multiple traditions. But the city's prosperity depended on peace between the two great empires. When that peace frayed, Palmyra's position became precarious. In the 3rd century, the city briefly rose to independence under Queen Zenobia, who challenged Roman authority and conquered a broad swath of territory. Rome responded with overwhelming force. The Emperor Aurelian crushed the rebellion, destroyed the city, and took Zenobia captive. Palmyra never fully recovered. It became a minor outpost, then a small village, and finally a collection of ruins scattered across the desert. The sand drifted in, covering the fallen columns and burying the marketplaces. For more than 1,000 years, the site was known only to local Bedouin shepherds and a few intrepid travelers. Then European explorers began to take notice. In the 1670s, an English merchant named Henry Mondrel visited the site and left a vivid description of the towering columns and the Temple of Bel, still standing amid the dunes. His account sparked curiosity, but it would be another 2 centuries before systematic study began. In the early 20th century, French archaeologists undertook major excavations, clearing the sand, mapping the street grid, and uncovering the inscriptions that revealed the city's political and religious life. They found the agora, the marketplace, lined with statues of prominent citizens, each with a dedication carved in stone. They uncovered the theater, the baths, and the vast necropolis with its distinctive tower tombs rising like stone sentinels above the plain. The most remarkable discovery was a tariff law inscribed on a stone slab, a detailed schedule of taxes on goods entering the city. It listed dates, camels, slaves, purple dye, and olive oil, each with a specific fee. This single document opened a window into the commercial operations of Palmyra, showing exactly how the city managed its trade and funded its public works. For decades, Palmyra was one of the best-preserved ancient cities in the Middle East, a destination for scholars and tourists alike. But in 2015, the world watched in horror as the city suffered deliberate destruction at the hands of a militant group. The ancient theater was used for executions, the Temple of Bel was blown up with explosives, the Triumphal Arch, a symbol of the city's imperial connections, was reduced to rubble. Statues were smashed with sledgehammers, their faces chiseled away. The loss was devastating not only for Syria but for the global heritage left in trust. Yet, even in the face of that violence, archaeology found a way to push back. Before the destruction, international teams had already begun documenting the site with laser scanning and high-resolution photography. Archaeologists and volunteers had created detailed 3-dimensional models of the major monuments, capturing every crack and carving. After the attacks, those digital records became a blueprint for reconstruction. Using the scans, the Institute for Digital Archaeology coordinated efforts to rebuild the Triumphal Arch as a physical replica, first displayed in London and later returned to a safer location. The process was not about erasing the tragedy. It was about preserving the memory of what had been lost and creating a record that future generations could use to understand the city as it once stood. The work continues. Fragments of fallen stone are collected, catalogued, and stored. In some areas, reconstruction has begun using original materials where possible. The goal is not to rebuild Palmyra as it was before the attack, that may take generations, but to ensure that the archaeological knowledge is never lost. The digital models, the excavation reports, and the inscriptions recorded over a century of research all form a permanent archive. Palmyra's story is a reminder that the work of bringing lost cities back into history is never finished. Even when a site is damaged or destroyed, the evidence gathered through careful archaeology survives. The stones may fall, but the knowledge remains. Along the coast of North Africa, another lost city waited beneath the dunes. Leptis Magna began as a small Phoenician settlement, but its destiny changed when a native son rose to become Emperor of Rome. Septimius Severus was born in Leptis Magna around the year 145, and when he took the throne in 193, he poured the wealth of the empire back into his hometown. He ordered the construction of a new forum, a massive basilica for legal proceedings, a grand theater carved into the hillside, and an artificial harbor that could accommodate the largest ships of the Mediterranean. The city became a showcase of Roman ambition, but it was also deeply rooted in its African surroundings. The stone carvings blended Roman gods with local Punic and Libyan motifs. Inscriptions appeared in Latin and in the local Punic dialect, a reminder that this was not a colony imposed from afar but a fusion of cultures. For 2 centuries, Leptis Magna thrived as a hub for trans-Saharan trade. Caravans arrived from the interior carrying gold, ivory, and exotic animals, while ships from Italy and Greece unloaded wine, oil, and pottery. The city's population swelled, and its public buildings rivaled those of Rome itself. Then the empire began to fracture. In the 4th and 5th centuries, trade routes shifted, and the city's harbor silted up. The Vandals swept through, and after them came the Byzantine reconquest, but the glory days were over. When the Arab conquest reached North Africa in the 7th century, Leptis Magna was already a shadow of its former self. The new rulers settled inland, and the coastal city was gradually abandoned. Without a population to maintain the structures, the desert moved in. Sand from the Sahara, driven by the wind, drifted through the streets and piled against the walls. Within a few generations, the forum, the basilica, the theater, everything vanished under a blanket of fine grit that rose as high as the rooftops. For over 1,000 years, the site lay hidden, known only to a few local shepherds and the occasional traveler who stumbled upon a broken column poking through the sand. The first European visitors in the 17th and 18th centuries described scattered remains, but no one grasped the true scale beneath the surface. That changed in the 1920s and 1930s. Under the direction of Italian archaeologists, a massive excavation campaign began. They hired hundreds of local workers to shift the sand by hand, and as the layers peeled away, the city emerged in astonishing condition. The sand had acted as a preservative, protecting the stone from erosion and vandalism. The Great Severan Forum, with its towering arches and sculpted panels, looked as if it could have been completed the previous decade. The basilica, with its double row of columns and intricate marble floor, was still intact. The theater, carved into the hillside, could seat over 3,000 spectators, and its stage backdrop, the skinny fronds, remained decorated with statues and reliefs. The harbor, though silted, still showed the outlines of quays and warehouses, but the most important discovery was not a single building. It was the cumulative weight of the evidence. Leptis Magna was not a provincial backwater. It was a fully realized Roman metropolis with a street grid, public baths, markets, a circus for chariot racing, and an advanced water system fed by aqueducts. The decorative arts, from the mosaics to the statuary, were of the highest quality, imported from workshops across the empire and adapted to local tastes. This forced historians to abandon the old narrative that saw Roman Africa as a distant frontier, a land of grain shipments and garrison towns. Leptis Magna proved that the continent was home to some of the most sophisticated urban centers of the ancient world. The city's revival was not just an archaeological triumph. It became a symbol of shared heritage, a place where African, Roman, and Mediterranean influences converged. For decades, visitors could walk its streets and stand in the forum where Septimius Severus had once addressed his people. Then, in the 21st century, Libya was swept by political turmoil. The site, remote and difficult to guard, was left vulnerable. There were reports of looting, vehicle tracks across the ancient paving stones, and damage from military activity. But the knowledge that had been recovered through those painstaking excavations could not be erased. Hundreds of photographs, architectural drawings, and scholarly publications had already documented every corner of Leptis Magna. Digital models created before the instability preserved the three-dimensional form of its monuments. The city had been brought back into history, and even if the stones suffered, the story was secure. That story of a North African metropolis that reshaped the Roman narrative stands as a lasting reminder that the empire's heart was never confined to Europe. And Leptis Magna was not the only Roman city in North Africa to challenge old assumptions. Deep in the mountains of modern Algeria, another Roman city lay hidden under the desert. Timgad, known to the ancients as Thamugadi, was founded around the year 100 by the Emperor Trajan. He planted it as a colony for retired Roman soldiers, a strategic outpost on the edge of the expanding empire where the rugged Ouros Mountains met the vast Sahara. For nearly 6 centuries, it thrived as a military settlement and a civilian town, a place where veterans could settle into peaceful life while still guarding the frontier. Then, in the 7th century, the region was transformed by the arrival of Arab conquest. The city was gradually abandoned, and without a population to maintain the structures, the desert moved in. Sand from the open plains drifted through the gates, filled the courtyards, and piled against the walls. Over the following centuries, Timgad was swallowed completely. Its streets, its arches, its public buildings, everything vanished beneath a blanket of fine grit that rose as high as the rooftops. Local farmers knew that something ancient lay beneath their fields, but the exact shape of the city was lost. By the late 18th century, European travelers began to notice fragments of carved stone and broken columns protruding from the dunes. But it was not until the late 19th century, under French colonial rule, that large-scale excavations began. French military engineers and archaeologists launched a systematic effort to uncover the buried town. They hired hundreds of local workers, and as the sand was cleared away, Timgad emerged in a state of preservation that left the excavators astonished. The city had been frozen in time. The street grid was laid out with a precision that could have been drawn with a ruler. 2 main thoroughfares, the Cardo running north to south and the Decumanus running east to west, crossed at the center where a triumphal arch stood. The arch, known as the Arch of Trajan, was still intact, its carved stonework and dedicatory inscription clear and legible. The Forum, a large open square surrounded by colonnades and public buildings, was uncovered in near original condition. The baths, both the large public baths and smaller neighborhood bathhouses, still held their heating systems, the hollow spaces beneath the floors and the channels for hot air. The theater, capable of seating over 3,000 spectators, was carved into the hillside, its stage and seating tiers still visible. But the most remarkable find was the library. It was one of the very few Roman libraries ever discovered. Its walls were still standing, and archaeologists could identify the niches where scrolls had once been stored. The building was small by modern standards, but for a frontier colony, it was a powerful statement of Roman values, order, learning, and civic pride. The library was not just a storage room. It was a symbol of the city's ambition, a place where retired soldiers and their families could read the works of Virgil and Livy, study philosophy, or consult legal texts. The inscriptions found throughout Timgad added layer upon layer of detail to this picture. Inscribed on stone slabs and building facades were the names of emperors, local magistrates, and military commanders. One inscription recorded the construction of the library, naming the benefactor who paid for it. Another documented the dedication of a temple to the goddess Ceres, the patron of grain and agriculture. A third listed the names of soldiers who had served in the 3rd Legion Augusta, the military unit that garrisoned the region. These inscriptions turned the silent stones into a living archive, telling the story of who lived here, what they believed, and how they governed themselves. The mosaics were even more vivid. The The floors of the bathhouses and private homes were covered in intricate patterns of colored stone. One mosaic showed a hunting scene with wild animals pursued by horsemen. Another depicted the mythological hero Hercules wrestling the Nemean lion. A third, found in the bath of a wealthy household, showed scenes from the daily life of the city: merchants selling goods, workers hauling stone, and a schoolroom with children learning to read. These were not just decorations, they were a window into the routines, the values, and the entertainments of a Roman colonial community far from the capital. Timgad's orthogonal layout, its perfect grid of streets intersecting at right angles, became the classic textbook example of Roman city planning. The Cardo and Decumanus divided the town into rectangular blocks, each block containing a handful of houses, shops, and workshops. The Forum sat at the intersection, surrounded by the Basilica for legal proceedings, the Curia for the town council, and the temples for the official guards. This was not a random growth. It was a deliberate design, a blueprint imposed by the imperial administration. Every new colony in the empire followed a similar pattern, but Timgad survived so completely that it allowed historians to study the plan in near-pristine condition. For the first time, scholars could walk the streets of a Roman colonial foundation and see exactly how the Romans organized space. The military barracks, the marketplaces, the public latrines, the water distribution system, all of it was exposed. Timgad became a laboratory for understanding how the Roman Empire projected its power and culture onto distant provinces. The city's reemergence did not just add a monument to the map. It brought the entire imperial project in Africa into sharp focus. Here was a place built from nothing by retired soldiers, designed by Roman engineers, and populated by men who had spent their careers conquering the world. They brought with them the language, the laws, the religion, and the architecture of Rome, and they planted it in the heart of a continent that had its own ancient traditions. The mosaics and inscriptions show that those traditions did not vanish. Local Berber deities appear alongside Roman gods. Punic names mingle with Latin ones in the lists of citizens. Timgad was not a simple transplant of Rome. It was a fusion, a new society that blended imperial ambition with African realities. And because the sand had preserved it so perfectly, we can still read that story on the walls and beneath our feet. For decades, Timgad was one of the best preserved Roman sites in North Africa, a destination for scholars and travelers. Then came the political turmoil of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Algeria experienced years of instability, and the site, remote and difficult to guard, suffered from neglect and occasional looting. But as with Leptis Magna, the damage to the stones could not erase the knowledge that had been recovered. Thousands of photographs, detailed architectural drawings, and decades of excavation reports had already captured every corner of Timgad. The city was no longer just a physical place. It was a permanent entry in the historical record, a perfect fossil of Roman colonialism that would inform our understanding of the ancient world for generations to come. And that record, written in stone and mosaic, continues to speak. It tells us that even on the edge of the Sahara, the empire built with precision, lived with ambition, and left behind a story that sand could not bury. Along the Aegean coast of Turkey, a different kind of burial took centuries. The city of Ephesus was not hidden by desert sand or jungle canopy. It was slowly choked by mud. Its harbor, once the busiest in the eastern Mediterranean, gradually filled with silt carried down by the Cayster River. Ship after ship found the channel shallower, the docks harder to reach. By the 15th century, the great port was a swamp, and the city that had depended on it for wealth and life was all but deserted. The marble temples, the colonnaded streets, the grand library, all of it sank into the marsh, remembered only in scattered texts and the fading memories of local villagers. For generations, travelers who passed through the region knew that something significant lay beneath the farmland and reeds. They could see the broken arch of a theater, a few columns poking from the mud, and the massive foundation of what had once been the Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. But that temple, dedicated to the Greek goddess of the hunt, had been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times before it was finally dismantled for building stone. Only its platform remained, a lonely rectangle of stone in a swampy field. Ephesus seemed destined to remain a ghost, a footnote in the histories of Greece and Rome. Then, in the late 19th century, a team from the Austrian Archaeological Institute arrived with a different vision. They did not come simply to collect statues or dig for treasure. They came to uncover the entire urban fabric. The work was slow, painstaking, and often interrupted by funding shortages and political changes. But over decades, the excavators peeled back the layers of silt and debris. What emerged was one of the most complete Roman cities ever recovered. The Library of Celsus, built around the year 125, stood again, its 2-story facade reconstructed from thousands of fragments discovered in the rubble. The Great Theatre, carved into the side of Mount Pion and capable of seating 25,000 spectators, was cleared of the earth that had filled its cavea. The marble streets, lined with shops and public fountains, reappeared, their paving stones still marked by the grooves of chariot wheels. The agora, the commercial heart of the city, was exposed, revealing the stalls where merchants sold everything from local olive oil to imported silk. And then there were the houses, the terrace houses as they are now called, were elite residences built into the hillside, their walls covered in frescoes and mosaics that had been preserved under layers of collapsed plaster and soil. These homes showed the daily life of Ephesus in vivid color: dining rooms with painted scenes of Greek myths, bedrooms decorated with floral patterns, and private bath suites with underfloor heating. The mosaics alone, some depicting theatrical masks, others showing geometric patterns, provided a record of artistic taste and social status that no written document could match. But Ephesus was not only a Roman city, it was also a crucial center for the spread of early Christianity. The Apostle Paul spent more than 2 years here, preaching and building a community. His letter to the Ephesians, one of the most influential texts in the New Testament, was addressed to the believers in this very city. The Great Theatre was the setting for a famous confrontation described in the book of Acts, when silversmiths who made statues of the goddess Artemis stirred up a riot against Paul, fearing that his message would hurt their trade. The archaeologists could now stand in that same theatre and imagine the uproar, the shouts of the crowd, the tension in the air. The connection between the physical site and the biblical story was no longer abstract. It was concrete, measurable, and visible. Inscriptions found throughout the city added layers of detail to the economic and social life. One long inscription, carved into the wall of a public building, listed the names of donors who funded the construction of the aqueduct system, along with the amounts they contributed. Another recorded a decree from the Roman governor regulating the price of bread during a shortage. A third was a funerary inscription for a wealthy woman who had paid for the renovation of a local bathhouse. These texts turned the silent stones into a living archive, revealing a community that was deeply engaged in commerce, civic pride, and religious competition. The Temple of Artemis, though reduced to its foundation, still held a powerful place in the city's identity. It was one of the largest temples ever built, 4 times the size of the Parthenon in Athens. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean to worship, leaving offerings of jewelry, coins, and statuettes. The temple was also a bank, a place where merchants and rulers deposited their wealth under the protection of the goddess. When the temple was destroyed by a mob in the 4th century, its stones were reused in later buildings, but its memory never faded. The Austrian team, working with local authorities, carefully excavated the platform and the surrounding precinct, recovering fragments of the columns and the sculpted drum that had once supported them. They even found parts of the altar where sacrifices had been offered for centuries. In recent decades, new technology has transformed the work at Ephesus. Ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity surveys allow archaeologists to map structures that remain buried without lifting a shovel. These methods have revealed entire neighborhoods, including a major marketplace and a set of public baths that had never been documented. The scans show streets and buildings lying just beneath the soil, waiting for future excavation. Ephesus is now one of the most visited archaeological sites in the Mediterranean. Hundreds of thousands of people walk its marble streets each year, standing where Paul once preached, gazing at the facade of the Library of Celsus, and sitting in the theater where the crowd once roared. The city that was slowly buried by silt and forgotten for centuries has been brought back to life, not as a ruin but as a window into the classical world and the early Christian era. And its recovery is a living example of what archaeology can achieve when patience, science, and dedication converge. The ground beneath our feet still holds countless secrets, and Ephesus proves that even a city swallowed by mud can rise again. In the highlands of central Anatolia, another lost capital waited. For centuries, the ruins scattered across the hills near the modern Turkish village of Bogaskale were little more than a curiosity to local farmers. They knew the area as a place of old stones, strange carvings, and underground chambers that seemed to lead nowhere. Travelers who passed through in the 18th and early 19th centuries made brief notes about the site, but no one connected it to the great empires of the ancient world. Then, in the late 19th century, reports reached European scholars of unusual inscriptions carved into the rock, a script that looked like nothing they had ever seen. In 1906, a German archaeologist named Hugo Winkler arrived with a team from the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, the German Oriental Society. They began digging with a clear goal: to find written records that might identify the site. What they uncovered exceeded every expectation. Beneath the soil lay the foundations of a vast city, ringed by massive stone walls that stretched for more than 6 kilometers. Gates stood at key points, flanked by carved lions and sphinxes, their weathered faces still bearing traces of the original paint. The walls were not simply barriers. They were engineering marvels built with a technique called cyclopean masonry, where enormous limestone blocks were fitted together without mortar, some weighing several tons each. The city was Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, a civilization that had been little more than a footnote in biblical and Egyptian texts. Winkler and his team soon hit the real treasure, a set of clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, buried in the archives of the royal palace. They were written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script used across Mesopotamia, but the language was unfamiliar. The tablets were a mix of diplomatic correspondence, religious rituals, legal codes, and historical chronicles. Among them was a crucial document, a treaty between the Hittite king Hattusili Roman III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses Roman II, written in both Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, and Hittite. This bilingual text became the key to deciphering the Hittite language. Over the following decades, scholars slowly cracked the code, revealing a linguistic family that belonged to the Indo-European branch, making Hittite the oldest known language in that family. The tablets told a story of an empire that had risen in central Anatolia around the 17th century BC and expanded to challenge both Egypt and Assyria. The Hittites were not a fringe people. They were a major military and diplomatic power, fielding armies that fought the Egyptians at the famous Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, one of the largest chariot battles in ancient history. They controlled vast territories stretching from the Aegean coast to the Euphrates River. The archives also revealed a sophisticated legal system with specific penalties for crimes, regulations for trade, and rules governing temple property. They recorded religious ceremonies, including festivals for the gods and rituals for purifying the king. One particularly detailed account described the construction of a new gate for the city, listing the materials, the number of workers, and the length of the project. The city itself was laid out on a series of terraces climbing the hillside. At the highest point stood the royal citadel, Buyukale, a fortified palace complex with its own walls and administrative buildings. Below it spread the lower city with residential neighborhoods, temples, and marketplaces. The most striking entrance was the Lion's Gate, where two massive stone lions, their mouths open in a silent roar, flanked the passage. The gate was not just decorative, it was a statement of power, a warning to any visitor that they were entering the domain of a king. Not far from the gate, the excavators discovered a subterranean chamber carved into the bedrock, its walls covered with hieroglyphic inscriptions. This was the chamber of the god, a sacred space where ritual offerings were made. The hieroglyphs, a distinct script used for official and monumental inscriptions, were different from the cuneiform tablets. They recorded the names of kings and their military victories, linking the written record to the physical architecture. The rediscovery of Hattusa did more than add another ruin to the map. It filled a massive gap in the history of the ancient Near East. Before these excavations, the Hittites were known almost entirely from scattered references in the Hebrew Bible and in Egyptian records, which portrayed them as a distant and somewhat mysterious people. The tablets and the city itself proved that they were a fully developed civilization with their own language, literature, law, and religion. They had traded with Babylon, corresponded with the pharaohs, and maintained a complex network of alliances and rivalries across the region. Their empire collapsed around the 12th century BC, part of the wider Bronze Age collapse that also brought down Mycenaean Greece and the new kingdom of Egypt. But their legacy survived in the clay they left behind and in the stones of a city that had been buried for over 3,000 years. When the German team completed their work, the Hittites entered the historical mainstream. Today, no scholar of the ancient world can ignore them. Hattusa, once a rumor in the hills, now stands as an UNESCO World Heritage Site, a place where the story of a forgotten empire was written in cuneiform and carved in stone. And its return to history proved again that the ground beneath our feet is still full of voices waiting to be heard. On the floodplains of the Indus River, another buried secret waited. For centuries, the mounds of broken brick and scattered pottery near the modern town of Lakhana in present-day Pakistan were known only to local villagers. They called the place Mohenjo-Daro, which means Mound of the Dead, a name that hinted at something ancient beneath the soil. But no one imagined that those crumbling hills held the remains of a city that had flourished around 2500 BC, a full millennium before the rise of classical Greece. Then in the 1920s, a team of British and Indian archaeologists working under the direction of Sir John Marshall began digging into the mounds. What they uncovered shocked the scholarly world. Beneath the accumulated earth lay the carefully planned grid of a Bronze Age metropolis. The streets ran straight and true, intersecting at right angles, dividing the city into rectangular blocks. The buildings were made of standardized fired bricks, all of them the same size and shape, suggesting a central authority that controlled construction. The houses were equipped with private wells and indoor bathrooms, and the wastewater was channeled through a network of covered drains that ran beneath the streets, lined with brick and fitted with inspection holes for cleaning. This was not a primitive settlement. It was a fully engineered urban center with a sanitation system that would not be matched in many parts of Europe until the 19th century. The most remarkable structure was the Great Bath. It was a large rectangular pool about 12 meters long and 7 meters wide, made of tightly fitted bricks and sealed with a thick layer of natural tar to prevent leakage. Steps led down into the water at both ends, and a surrounding colonnade sheltered the bathers. No one knows exactly what rituals took place there, but the presence of such a carefully built public water feature, central to the city's layout, suggests that purification played a key role in the culture. The bath was not a luxury, it was a statement of shared values, but for all the sophistication of its architecture, Mohenjo-Daro left behind a profound silence. The people of the Indus Valley wrote, and they wrote extensively, but their script remains undeciphered to this day. Over 400 distinct symbols appear on seals, pottery, and small tablets, usually in short sequences. Despite more than a century of attempts, no Rosetta Stone has been found, no bilingual text that could unlock the meaning. Scholars argue about whether the script represents a full language or a system of symbols for trade and administration. The absence of a key means that the voices of Mohenjo-Daro's inhabitants are locked inside those markings, heard but not understood. That mystery deepens the intrigue around the city's decline. Around 1900 BC, the great urban centers of the Indus Valley began to fade. The precise cause is still debated. Some researchers point to a shift in the monsoon patterns that reduced rainfall, making agriculture harder to sustain. Others argue that the Indus River itself changed course, stranding the city away from the water source that had made it possible. There is evidence of increasing social stress, with wells and drains falling into disrepair in the final phases. There is no sign of invasion or violent destruction. The city seems to have been gradually abandoned, its people dispersing to smaller villages and new regions. Whatever the reason, Mohenjo-Daro was slowly swallowed by the floodplain, its streets filled with silt, its bricks scavenged for later buildings. It vanished from human memory for nearly 4,000 years. The excavations of the 1920s and 30s did more than recover a lost city. They forced historians to rewrite the timeline of urban civilization in South Asia. Before Mohenjo-Daro, the earliest complex societies were thought to have emerged only in Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Indus cities proved that a third Great Bronze Age civilization had flourished at the same time, with its own distinctive urban planning, its own trade networks that stretched to the Persian Gulf, and its own unique artistic traditions. The carefully carved seals, the bronze sculptures like the famous dancing girl, and the intricate jewelry all showed a society that valued craft and commerce. The city of Harappa, located about 600 kilometers to the north, was unearthed in the same period and told a parallel story. Together, these two sites and the many smaller settlements that surround them revealed the scale of the Indus civilization, a culture that covered an area larger than either Mesopotamia or Egypt. And with each new discovery, the silence of that undeciphered script becomes more tantalizing. What secrets remain locked in those tiny symbols on clay and stone? The answer may one day come from an unexpected source, a new technology, a chance discovery, or a fresh approach to an old puzzle. Until then, Mohenjo-Daro stands as a magnificent question mark, a civilization that we can see, touch, and walk through, but whose inner life we can only guess at. Before Mohenjo-Daro rose from the soil, another city had already whispered its presence. In the 1850s, British engineers building the Lahore to Multan Railway ran out of ballast material. They turned to the crumbling brick mounds that dotted the landscape near the town of Harappa, digging into them for crushed stone to lay the tracks. For years, the workers hauled away thousands of bricks, unaware that they were destroying the remains of a civilization that had flourished 4 millennia earlier. Local reports of the site reached the Archaeological Survey of India, but the scale was not grasped until the 1920s, when systematic excavations began under the same Sir John Marshall, who would later uncover Mohenjo-Daro. The diggers found a city built on the same principles: straight streets, standardized fired bricks, and a drainage system that would not be out of place in a modern town. But Harappa held a surprise. The bricks were not random in size. They followed a precise ratio, roughly 1:2:4, a module that appeared in every building across the city. This was not a local preference, it was a marker of a shared culture that stretched across the entire Indus Valley. The seals found at Harappa were identical in style to those later uncovered hundreds of kilometers away. The pottery, with its distinctive geometric patterns and black-on-red designs, matched the wares from Mohenjo-Daro. The weights, made of chert and carefully polished, followed a uniform system that must have been enforced by a central authority or agreed upon by a network of traders. Harappa was not an isolated town. It was part of a vast civilization that covered an area larger than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia. The discovery of this standardized culture changed everything. Before the 1920s, historians assumed that South Asia's first cities appeared only in the first millennium BC, long after the great river valley societies of the Middle East. Harappa, along with Mohenjo-Daro, shattered that timeline. Here was a Bronze Age civilization that built planned cities, wrote in a script still undeciphered, and traded with the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia. Tiny carnelian beads from the Indus have been found in the royal tombs at Ur, and Mesopotamian texts mention a distant land called Meluha, widely believed to refer to the Indus Valley. The trade flowed in both directions: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, copper from Oman, and timber from the Himalayas all passed through Harappa's markets. The city itself was a manufacturing hub. Excavations revealed workshops for bead-making, metalworking, and pottery firing, all organized in specialized districts. The economy was not just agricultural, it was industrial. Understanding how Harappa was governed remains one of archaeology's greatest puzzles. No palace or royal tomb has been found. No monumental statues of kings or inscriptions proclaiming conquests. The absence of such markers suggests a political system very different from the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mesopotamia. Some scholars propose a network of merchant councils or priestly elites who managed affairs through consensus rather than command. Others argue that the city-states were independent but linked by trade and a shared cultural identity. The seals may have been used for administration, stamping goods to certify their origin or ownership, but without the ability to read the script, the exact function remains speculative. The work continues. After the partition of India in 1947, the site fell within Pakistan, and Pakistani archaeologists took over the excavations. International teams from the United States, Italy, and Japan have joined the effort using modern techniques. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed the full extent of the city, which covers about 150 hectares. New trenches expose layers of habitation that trace the city's growth and decline over centuries. One recent discovery was a large public structure, possibly a granary or a hall for gatherings, with a series of brick platforms and ventilation channels that suggest careful planning. The diggers also found a cemetery where the dead were buried with pottery and personal ornaments, offering clues about social status and religious beliefs. The sheer volume of pottery fragments, millions of them, has allowed researchers to map the city's changing patterns of consumption over time. Each new season adds another piece to the puzzle. Yet the fundamental questions remain open. Why did Harappa and the other Indus cities decline around 1900 BC? The evidence suggests a gradual process, not a sudden collapse. The drainage systems fell into disrepair, houses were subdivided as the population may have shrunk, and the standardized brick sizes gave way to more irregular construction. Some archaeologists point to a shift in the course of the Ravi River, which once flowed near Harappa but later moved away, cutting the city off from its water supply and the trade routes that depended on it. Others cite changes in the monsoon patterns that reduced agricultural yields over generations. There is no evidence of invasion or violent destruction. The city seems to have been slowly abandoned, its people dispersing to smaller settlements in the region. The last residents left behind their pots and their seals, but they took with them the knowledge of how to build a city of bricks and drains. For nearly 4,000 years, the mounds lay silent, their contents slowly eroding under the rain and wind. When the railway builders arrived in the 19th century, they saw only a source of cheap stone. It took the patient work of archaeologists in the 20th and 21st centuries to recognize what those bricks represented. Harappa, together with Mohenjo-Daro and dozens of smaller sites, brought a lost world back into the historical record, a world that stood alongside the great civilizations of antiquity, spoke its own language, built its own cities, and left behind a legacy that we are still learning to read. The ground beneath the wheat fields of Punjab still holds countless secrets, and every shovel of dirt brings us closer to understanding a society that once shaped the course of human history. Centuries before the first cities of Mesopotamia, a different kind of settlement rose on the plains of central Turkey. Çatalhöyük dates back to around 7100 BC, a time when most of humanity still lived in small, nomadic bands. Yet here stood a village of several thousand people, packed together in a honeycomb of mud brick houses with no streets or alleys between them. The only way to move through the community was across the rooftops, climbing from one terrace to another and descending through a hole in the ceiling to enter a home. Each house was a single room with plastered walls, sleeping platforms, and hearths, all built so tightly that they shared walls with their neighbors. This was not a city in the classical sense, no grand temples, no palaces, no defensive walls, but it was a settled, cooperative society that had figured out how to feed, shelter, and organize a large population long before the invention of writing or the rise of the first true cities in the Fertile Crescent. The site was first excavated in the 1950s by a British archaeologist named James Millart. He uncovered something extraordinary. Beneath the layers of collapsed roof beams and accumulated debris, the walls were covered in vivid paintings. There were scenes of hunting with wild bulls and deer racing across the plaster, and geometric patterns outlined in red and black. One chamber contained a painting of a volcano erupting, possibly depicting the nearby Mount Hassan, an image that may be the oldest known landscape painting in the world. Millart also found burial practices that startled the archaeological community. The dead were buried beneath the floors of the houses, often with their knees drawn up to their chests, and the bodies were sometimes painted with red ochre before being laid to rest. Skulls were occasionally detached and plastered, reshaped to resemble living faces, a practice that suggests a deep connection between the living and the ancestors who remained under the same roof. These discoveries made Çatalhöyük famous almost overnight. It was hailed as the world's oldest known town, a window into the Neolithic mind, but Millart's career soon became entangled in controversy. In the 1960s, he was implicated in a scandal involving faked artifacts from another site. His reputation never fully recovered, and for decades the findings at Çatalhöyük were viewed with suspicion. Some scholars wondered if the wall paintings were authentic or if the interpretation had been exaggerated. The site fell into a kind of limbo, its potential locked behind questions of trust. Then in the 1990s, a new team led by Ian Hodder of Stanford University took up the work. Hodder brought a radically different approach. Instead of focusing on spectacular art and unusual burials, his excavation set out to record every scrap of evidence with scientific rigor. Every layer of soil was sieved, every bone fragment, seed, and flake of obsidian was catalogued. The aim was not to find treasures but to reconstruct the daily rhythm of life in the settlement. What did people eat? How did they organize their households? What did they do with their waste? The answers transformed our understanding of the Neolithic. The diet was remarkably varied. Analysis of plant remains showed that the inhabitants grew wheat, barley, and peas, but they also gathered wild fruits, nuts, and seeds. Animal bones revealed that they kept sheep and goats, but also hunted deer, wild cattle, and even leopards. The obsidian tools, brought from sources hundreds of kilometers away, proved that Çatalhöyük was part of a wide trade network long before the invention of the wheel. The houses themselves told a story of social equality. No single dwelling was larger or more richly furnished than the others. No evidence of a ruling class or a centralized authority emerged. The community seemed to have been organized around household units that managed their own food, tools, and rituals. The wall paintings, when they were found again in the new excavations, were more varied and layered than Malat had suggested. Some were simple red hands pressed against the plaster. Others showed geometric patterns that may have represented maps or celestial events. The plastering and replastering of walls, sometimes over 100 layers in a single room, indicated that the act of decorating and maintaining the house was itself a form of ritual, a way of renewing the home and the family. The burials beneath the floors were not fearsome or morbid. They were intimate. The dead stayed close, their presence woven into the fabric of daily life. When the researchers used DNA analysis on the bones, they discovered that the people buried in a given house were often not biological relatives. They were chosen. The household was a social unit, not strictly a genetic one. This finding challenged the assumption that early villages were organized around bloodlines. At Çatalhöyük, people chose who to live with and who to remember. After about 1,500 years, the settlement was abandoned. No single cause has been identified. The climate may have shifted, making farming less reliable. The population may have grown too large for the resources available. Or perhaps the social structure that had held the community together simply changed, and people chose to live in smaller, more dispersed groups. Whatever the reason, the rooftops were left to collapse, the houses filled with wind-blown dust, and the entire settlement was slowly buried under the alluvial plain. For 7,000 years it lay hidden. When the spades of the 1950s first broke the surface, no one imagined that this dusty mound would rewrite the story of human settlement. Çatalhöyük pushed back the timeline of complex, settled living by thousands of years, far before the rise of the first true cities in Mesopotamia. It proved that the urge to live together in large, permanent communities was not a late invention driven by kings and scribes. It was a deep human impulse that emerged independently in multiple places, and even older sites still hidden in the dirt are waiting to challenge our assumptions once more. A temple older than the first cities was deliberately buried. In the 1990s, a Kurdish shepherd noticed strange stones protruding from the ground on a barren hilltop in southeastern Turkey. He reported the find to local authorities, and word reached the German Archaeological Institute. In 1995, a team led by Klaus Schmidt began excavating. What they uncovered was unlike anything in the archaeological record. The hill, known as Göbekli Tepe, contained multiple circular enclosures built of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, each weighing between 10 and 20 tons. The pillars were arranged in rings like standing stones in a prehistoric circle, but these were not rough, natural boulders. They were carefully carved with flat faces and rounded tops. The surfaces were covered in reliefs of wild animals, foxes, snakes, scorpions, boars, cranes, and a menacing predator, perhaps a lion or a leopard. The carvings were precise and deliberate, the work of skilled artisans working with stone tools. The date was the most shocking part. Radiocarbon analysis placed the construction at around 9600 BC, a full 6,000 years before the pyramids of Giza. This was the Neolithic period, but not the settled, agricultural Neolithic that scholars had long described. Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers, people who still lived in small, mobile bands and had not yet domesticated plants or animals. The standard theory of human civilization held that agriculture came first, that the need to store and manage grain surpluses forced people into permanent settlements, which in turn allowed the specialization of labor and the rise of complex societies. Religion and monumental architecture were supposed to be late products of that process, built by farming communities with stable food supplies and organized hierarchies. Göbekli Tepe flipped that sequence. Here was a massive ritual complex built by people who had no permanent villages, no pottery, no metal tools, and no domesticated crops. The sheer effort required to quarry, carve, and transport the limestone pillars, then raise them into place, implies a coordinated labor force and a shared belief system strong enough to motivate people to gather from far away. The site was not a settlement. There are no signs of permanent housing, no hearths for daily cooking, no trash pits filled with domestic waste. It was a meeting place, a sanctuary where hunter-gatherers converged for ceremonies that may have included feasting. Excavators found huge quantities of animal bones, mostly gazelle and wild cattle, suggesting that large groups ate together at specific times of the year. The pillars themselves show no evidence of representing gods or a single deity. They may be stylized human figures, the T-shape echoing a head and shoulders, with arms carved along the sides and hands meeting at the belly. The animal reliefs could be totems, clan symbols, or spirit guides. No one knows for certain. The interpretation remains one of the most heated debates in archaeology. Some researchers argue that the complex was a site for ancestor worship or initiation rituals. Others suggest it served as a calendar or astronomical observatory, the alignments of the pillars and enclosures oriented to the stars. A third camp proposes that Göbekli Tepe was part of a hunter-gatherer network that used ritual gatherings to negotiate territory and resources. The most controversial theory, put forward by Schmidt himself, is that the need to feed the workers and visitors to Göbekli Tepe may have driven the invention of agriculture. Hunter-gatherers, he argued, would have had to produce enough grain and meat on a regular basis to support the large gatherings. They began to cultivate wild cereals and herd wild sheep and goats to ensure a reliable supply. Over generations, those practices became full agriculture. According to this view, the urge to worship and gather in a sacred place, not the pressure of survival, was the engine that pushed humanity toward farming. If true, this means that the first farmers did not stumble upon agriculture by accident in their search for food. They created it intentionally to support their religion. This idea remains speculative, but it has forced a fundamental rethinking of the Neolithic Revolution. The old story of a gradual, necessary shift from foraging to farming is now seen as too simple. Göbekli Tepe suggests that human beings are driven by more than material needs, that we build monuments and gather in great numbers because of beliefs and social bonds that have nothing to do with filling our stomachs. The site also held another mystery. At some point around 8000 BC, the enclosure was deliberately buried. The pillars were toppled, and the entire complex was covered with tons of rubble and soil. This was not natural erosion or abandonment. It was a careful act of closure, as if the people who built it decided to seal it away. For nearly 11,000 years, the hill remained undisturbed, its contents hidden from the world. The deliberate burial preserved the site in extraordinary condition. The carvings survived in crisp detail, and the structural layout remained intact. When the excavators first cleared the top layers, they found a perfectly preserved pillar still standing in its socket, the animal reliefs sharp as the day they were chiseled. The ongoing work continues to reveal new enclosures. So far, only a small fraction of the site has been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar suggests that dozens more circular structures lie buried beneath the hill, each filled with its own set of pillars and carvings. The scale is staggering. Göbekli Tepe may have been the largest ritual complex in the world at the time it was built. Every new season of excavation adds another layer of complexity to the story. Controversies swirl around almost every aspect of the site. Some scholars question the accuracy of the dating, though multiple labs have confirmed the radiocarbon results. Others argue that the site was not built by hunter-gatherers at all, but by an unknown sedentary population that left no other trace. The lack of any residential structures nearby remains puzzling. Some geologists have proposed that the site was a natural formation that happened to look like a temple, but the carved pillars and orderly layout make that interpretation difficult to sustain. The debate is healthy. It means that Göbekli Tepe is not a settled fact but an active frontier, a place where the evidence challenges our assumptions and forces us to ask new questions. What were those people trying to say with their stone circles and animal spirits? How did they coordinate the labor to build something that required hundreds of people working for months? And why did they choose to bury it all so carefully, leaving no trace for the next 10,000 years? The answer, if it comes, will not come from a single artifact or inscription. It will emerge from the slow accumulation of data, from the analysis of pollen, bone, and stone, from the patterns of wear on the pillars and the distribution of animal remains across the site. It will require humility from the archaeologists, a willingness to admit that our models of the past are always provisional. But that is exactly what makes Göbekli Tepe so important. It did not just add another lost city to the list. It brought back an entire chapter of human experience that had been erased from memory, a time when our ancestors gathered on a barren hill in the Taurus foothills, raised stones that weighed as much as a truck, and then walked away, leaving the monument to stand in silence for millennia. That chapter had no written history, no kings, no coins, no cities, but it was real, and its rediscovery has changed the way we think about what it means to be human. Across the Atlantic, another buried world forced a rewrite of North American history. For centuries, the canyons of what is now Colorado held a secret known only to the Ute and Navajo peoples, who spoke of ancient stone villages tucked high into the cliffs. Anglo settlers who passed through the region in the 19th century saw only scattered ruins and assumed they were the remains of some unknown, vanished tribe, perhaps even a lost race from across the sea. The prevailing narrative of the time imagined Native Americans as nomadic, rootless peoples who had never built permanent cities or complex societies. That story began to crack in the late 1880s when two cowboys, Richard Wetherill and his brother-in-law Charlie Mason, were searching for lost cattle in a deep canyon. They noticed a set of handholds carved into the sandstone, climbed the cliff, and stepped into a village that had been sealed for over 6 centuries. It was Cliff Palace, a multi-story complex of rooms, towers, and kivas built into a natural alcove high above the canyon floor. The scale stunned them. Here were over 150 rooms stacked in terraces with windows and doors perfectly framed in stone. The wood beams still held the roofs. Pottery lay where it had been left. The cowboys dug into the site, removing artifacts and selling them to museums and collectors. A practice that today would be called looting, but at the time was seen as legitimate exploration. Their discoveries attracted the attention of photographers and tourists. One photographer, Frederick Chapin, published images that reached a national audience, sparking a wave of public fascination. Archaeologists soon arrived, including Gustaf Nordenskjöld, a Swedish scholar who carefully documented the structures and collected artifacts for the National Museum of Finland. But the most impactful figure was a young woman named Virginia McClurg, who campaigned tirelessly for the protection of the sites. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the act that created Mesa Verde National Park, the first national park in the United States established specifically to preserve cultural heritage. With the land protected, systematic archaeology could begin in earnest. Researchers mapped the entire region, discovering that Cliff Palace was just one of hundreds of sites scattered across the mesas and canyons. There were villages built into the cliffs and others perched on the flat mesa tops. Some were single-family homes, others housed dozens of families. The builders were the ancestral Pueblones, a people who had lived in the Four Corners region for over 1,000 years. They were not a lost race or a mysterious tribe. They were the direct ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, including the Hopi, Zuni, and Acoma. The cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde represented the final chapter of their long history in the area, constructed between the 12th and 13th centuries. Why did they build in such inaccessible places? The evidence suggests a combination of pressures. The climate was changing. Tree ring studies, a technique developed by astronomer A. Douglas in the early 20th century, allowed archaeologists to date the wooden beams with remarkable precision. The rings showed that severe droughts struck the region in the late 11th century and again in the late 13th century. The droughts lasted decades, shriveling the maize fields that were the foundation of the ancestral Puebloan diet. Resources grew scarce, and competition for land and water intensified. The cliff dwellings, with their narrow entrances and defensive positions, suggest a society under threat, perhaps from rival groups or from internal conflict. The population, which had grown steadily for centuries, may have exceeded what the land could support even in good years. The tree rings also showed that construction stopped around 1285. The last beams were cut, the last roofs laid. Then the villages fell silent. The inhabitants did not vanish. They migrated south and east, joining existing communities in the Rio Grande Valley and on the Hopi mesas. Their descendants still tell stories of the journey, of leaving behind the homes their ancestors had carved into the cliffs. The abandonment was not a collapse. It was a slow, deliberate move driven by hardship but carried out with care. The pottery left behind, the tools, the everyday objects, all of it hints at a planned departure, not a frantic flight. For centuries after, the sites were known only to the Pueblo peoples, who visited them as sacred places, and to the Ute and Navajo, who hunted in the canyons. Then the cowboys and photographers arrived, and the outside world learned what had been hidden in plain sight. The archaeology that followed did more than recover a set of ruins. It placed the ancestral Pueblones at the center of North American prehistory. Their towns were not temporary camps. They were engineered communities with sophisticated water management, astronomical alignments, and a trade network that spanned the continent. Turquoise from the southwest, shells from the Gulf of California, and macaw feathers from Mexico all ended up in the storerooms of Mesa Verde. The people were farmers, potters, weavers, and traders, living in dense settlements long before Europeans set foot on the continent. The narrative of nomadic tribes roaming an empty land was a myth, convenient for colonial expansion but contradicted by the stone and bone beneath the soil. Mesa Verde did not just add a lost city to the map. It restored a civilization to its proper place in history, a civilization that built cities in the cliffs, measured the stars, and chose to leave when the rains failed. And its story, preserved in the rings of pinyon pines and the patterns of black-on-white pottery, continues to speak across the centuries. On the floodplains of the Mississippi, another lost city rose from the earth, and it was the largest urban center north of Mexico that no one in the modern world had ever heard of. Cahokia flourished between the years 1050 and 1350, a span of 3 centuries that placed it squarely in the medieval period, yet its existence was almost entirely absent from the history books taught in schools. The site sits near present-day St. Louis, a stretch of bottomland where the Mississippi and Missouri rivers meet. Early European settlers noticed the mounds, hundreds of them, rising from the flat plain like misshapen hills. They assumed the mounds were natural features, glacial remnants, or perhaps the work of some vanished, mysterious race that had nothing to do with the Native American peoples they encountered. This dismissal was convenient. It allowed colonists to claim the land as empty and available, ignoring the sophisticated civilization that had once thrived there. But the mounds were not natural. They were built one basket load of earth at a time by a society that organized thousands of workers over generations. The largest monk's mound, named for a community of Trappist monks who lived nearby in the 19th century, covers over 14 acres at its base and rises to a height of about 100 feet. It is the largest prehistoric earthwork in the Americas north of Mexico. Its flat summit once supported a massive structure, likely the residence of the ruler or a temple, a wooden building that would have dominated the skyline for miles. The construction of Monk's Mound required moving an estimated 15 million basket loads of soil. That kind of coordinated labor implies a central authority with the power to command and the resources to feed the workers. For decades, the true nature of Cahokia remained obscured. Local farmers plowed the mounds, digging into them for filled dirt. Developers leveled smaller mounds for roads and housing. It was not until the 20th century, and especially the 1960s and 1970s, that systematic archaeology began to reveal the scale of what had been lost. Researchers mapped over 120 mounds spread across an area of about 6 square miles. They found the remnants of a wooden palisade that enclosed the central precinct, a wall built of thousands of logs set upright, reinforced with bastions and rebuilt several times. Within that enclosure lay a grand plaza, a flat, open space the size of 35 football fields where public ceremonies and games were held. The residential district stretched outward from the center, with neighborhoods arranged by social class. The elite lived closest to the mounds on higher ground, in houses with plastered walls and thatched roofs. Commoners lived farther out, in smaller homes clustered around courtyards. The population at its peak may have reached between 10,000 and 20,000 people, making Cahokia larger than London at the same time. One of the most intriguing discoveries was a circle of posts known as Woodhenge. Archaeologists found a series of large pits arranged in concentric arcs. They had once held cedar logs, and the pattern aligned with the rising sun at the solstices and equinoxes. This was a calendar, a way of tracking the seasons for planting and harvest, and also likely for scheduling religious festivals. The precision of the alignments shows a deep understanding of astronomy, the same kind of knowledge that drove the construction of Stonehenge across the Atlantic. The economy of Cahokia depended on maize, beans, and squash, the classic triad of Mesoamerican agriculture adapted to the temperate Midwest. But the city also sat at the center of a vast trade network. Evidence from excavations shows that Cahokians imported copper from the Great Lakes region, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from the Appalachian Mountains, and obsidian from as far away as Yellowstone. One striking artifact is a cache of finely carved stone points made from a type of flint found only in the Ozarks. These points were not tools, they were ceremonial objects buried with high-status individuals. The distribution of such goods across the region shows that Cahokia was not an isolated settlement. It was the hub of a sphere of influence that extended across much of what is now the central United States, connecting communities through trade, shared symbolism, and probably political ties. The society was clearly stratified. Excavations of burials reveal sharp differences in wealth and status. Some graves contain elaborate offerings, hundreds of shell beads, copper plates, and stone figurines. Others contain only the body with no accompanying goods. One famous burial, known as the Birdman burial, was found in a mound near the center. The individual lay on a bed of over 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Nearby were the remains of several other individuals, possibly retainers sacrificed to accompany the elite. The burial also included a stone tablet carved with a human figure dressed in bird feathers, a motif that appears across the Mississippian world. This burial and others like it points to a society with powerful rulers who commanded not just labor but also ultimate loyalty. Then, around the year 1350, Cahokia began to decline. The mound building stopped, the population shrank. By the time the first French explorers arrived in the late 17th century, the site was abandoned, its mounds covered in grass and trees. The reasons for the decline are still debated. Evidence from sediment cores and tree rings points to a period of severe drought in the region between 1290 and 1350. The maize fields that fed the city would have failed repeatedly. Floods from the Mississippi may have added to the stress, eroding farmland and destroying infrastructure. At the same time, there are signs of political instability. The palisade was rebuilt several times, suggesting conflict, perhaps raids from outside groups or internal rebellion. The resource base, once rich enough to support a dense population, may have been exhausted by over-farming. Wood for construction and fuel would have become scarce as the surrounding forests were cleared. Whatever the combination of factors, the people did not vanish. They migrated, forming new communities in the southern Mississippi Valley and along the Gulf Coast. Their descendants include the Osage, the Chickasaw, and the Choctaw, among others. But the memory of the great city faded, preserved only in oral traditions and in the mounds themselves, which local indigenous peoples continued to treat as sacred places. When archaeologists finally uncovered the true story of Cahokia, it did not simply add another ruin to the map. It shattered the old narrative that North America before European contact was a sparsely populated continent of small, nomadic bands. Here was a city of 10,000 or more people with monumental architecture, a stratified society, a coordinated economy, and a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, all built without metal tools or draft animals, all operating centuries before the arrival of Columbus. The mound builders were not a lost race. They were the ancestors of living Native American nations, and their achievements belong to the same story as the great cities of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. Cahokia was a medieval city on American soil, and its rediscovery forces us to see the continent not as a wilderness waiting to be tamed, but as a place where complex urban societies had already risen, flourished, and passed into memory long before the first European ships appeared on the horizon. The mounds still stand, silent but speaking, and every shovel of dirt that turns up a shell bead or a post hole adds another sentence to a history that is still being written. Look back across the 20 cities you have just walked through. From the jungle temples of Angkor to the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, from the stone circles of Göbekli Tepe to the buried palaces of Persepolis, a single thread runs through every one of them. Each was not simply rediscovered as a pile of old stones. Each was resurrected as a living society, a community of people who thought, built, traded, worshipped, and adapted to their world in ways that historians had refused to believe possible. Every one of these cities forced a revision of some deeply held assumption. Angkor proved that medieval Southeast Asia built a metropolis larger than any in contemporary Europe. Great Zimbabwe shattered the colonial myth that Africa had no civilizations of its own. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa pushed the origins of urban life in South Asia back by millennia and revealed a level of civic planning that would not be matched for thousands of years. Cahokia showed that North America before Columbus was not an empty wilderness but a continent of cities, with complex economies and astronomical knowledge carved into earth and sky. The pattern is unmistakable. What we think we know about the past is always provisional, always subject to revision by the next shovel, the next radar scan, the next curious mind willing to question the story that has been handed down. And the work is far from finished. For every city that has been brought back into the light, there are likely dozens more still buried beneath the earth, hidden under desert sand, swallowed by jungle, or submerged beneath the waves of the ocean. Some of those sites are already being surveyed, their outlines faintly visible in satellite imagery or ground-penetrating radar. Others remain completely unknown, waiting for a farmer to plow up a broken pot, a child to find a carved stone, or a scientist to notice an unusual shape in a distant hill. The archaeologists who dedicate their lives to this work are not just digging up artifacts. They are restoring voices that have been silent for centuries, correcting narratives shaped by prejudice and ignorance, and reminding us that the human story is far richer and more surprising than any single telling can capture. That is the quiet power of their labor, and it deserves our attention and our gratitude. If any of these cities surprised you, if one of them changed the way you think about the past, that is exactly the point. The ground beneath your feet holds secrets that could rewrite everything we think we know. All it takes is someone patient enough to look and curious enough to ask. If you enjoyed this journey through the lost cities of history, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the hidden past, and leave a comment telling us which lost city you found most surprising. The next discovery might be just beneath the surface, and you never know where the next shovel will strike.